The rancher said it in front of everyone. It was June 1957, and the cookhouse at the Alderman's Spread sat at the edge of a wide working ranch 12 miles outside Dubois, Wyoming, in the shadow of the Wind River Range, where the snow on the peaks didn't fully leave until July. The kind of cookhouse that had been feeding men since before the war, a long pine table down the center, a cast-iron range along the east wall, a window above the sink that looked out over the horse barn, and a smell that was bacon grease and wood smoke, and something underneath both of those, the residue of 10,000 early mornings that had started in that room. Nora Hallett was standing at the range when Harold Alderman came in. She did not turn around. He said her services would no longer be required as of that. He said the ranch was bringing in a new arrangement for the bunkhouse and the cookhouse, and it had nothing to do with the quality of her work. He wanted to be clear about that. He said there was 2 weeks of pay in an envelope on the table, and he hoped she understood there was no ill feeling on his part. 8 ranch hands were eating at that table. Not one of them. At the far end of the table, closest to the door, a man in a canvas workshirt had been eating since before the others came in. He had a cup of coffee in front of him, and a plate he was not finishing. He was watching the window above the sink. Not the rancher, the window. Here is the story. Nora Hallett had come to the Alderman's Spread in the spring of 1948, 9 years before that morning. She came with a 12-year-old son named Thomas and a letter of reference from a ranch outside Lander where she had cooked for 4 seasons. Her husband, Ray Hallett, had died in February of that year. He had been a fence hand on a different spread north of Dubois, and he had gone out in weather he should not have gone out in, and he had not. The ranch he worked for sent a letter and a money order for $80, which represented the wages he was owed through the end of January. They said they were sorry for the loss. Nora took the $80 and the letter of reference from Lander and drove south to the Alderman's Spread, because she had heard they needed a cook and because the bunkhouse arrangement there included a small attached room that could fit 2 people if one of them was not yet full grown. Harold Alderman looked at her references and looked at the boy and said he'd try it for a season. She was still there 9 years later. She cooked breakfast at 5 in the morning, and dinner at 6 in the evening, and a midday meal when the hands were working close enough to come in. She kept the cookhouse the way a woman keeps a place that she understands is not hers but treats as if it were, because that is the kind of work she believed in. A cast-iron range had needed a new grate in 1951, and she had sourced the part herself and fitted it herself, because Harold Alderman was not a man who noticed things until they stopped working. The window above the sink had a broken latch since 1953 that she had shimmed with a folded piece of tin so it would stay closed in the wind. Thomas had gone to the school in Dubois until he then worked on the spread for 2 years as a fence hand, then enlisted in the army in 1954. He was stationed in West Germany. He wrote once a month. His letters came to the cookhouse address because that was the only address he had. In the spring of 1957, a film company came to Dubois. They were shooting exterior scenes in the range country, wide country that photographed the way that part of Wyoming photographs like the world was new, and there was nothing between you and the mountains but clean air and the particular quality of light that came off snowmelt at altitude. The production was using local ranch hands as background, local horses, and wherever they could manage it, local facility. Harold Alderman had an arrangement with the production company. The arrangement was that a portion of the crew would be fed from the Alderman cookhouse for 6 weeks during the shoot. Nora Hallett had been feeding 12 men. She was now feeding 26, twice a day, with the same range and the same pine table and a folding table borrowed from the church hall in Dubois. She did not complain. She ordered the additional provisions, and she managed the timing, and she fed 26 men at 5 in the morning, some of whom had been in Hollywood long enough to have opinions about food, and none of them went hungry. One of the men who came in early and ate quietly and did not have opinions about food had been coming in for 3 weeks. He wore plain clothes. He did not talk much at the table. He was a working man eating a working man's breakfast, and Nora treated him the same way she treated the fence hands, which was to say, she put food in front of him and let him be. She did not know who he was until the 2nd week, when one of the wranglers said his name crossing the yard, and she heard it through the window above the sink and understood the shimmed latch had been doing more work than she knew. She did not treat him any differently after that. That was the kind of woman she was. Then it was June, the 6th week, and Harold Alderman came into the cookhouse at 7:15 with his envelope and his explanation, and Nora Hallett stood at the range and listened to it and did not turn around, and the 8 hands at the table looked at their plates, and the man at the far end of the table looked at the window. What Alderman was doing was legal, and it was efficient, quality of a thing that had been thought through in advance and delivered, now that the film crew was almost gone and the arrangement was almost over, and the additional pay Nora had been drawing for the expanded service was about to end anyway. What he was bringing in was his daughter-in-law's cousin, a younger woman from Riverton who wanted the position. That was what it was. He was practical, which is sometimes a more efficient instrument than cruelty. Nora Hallett set down the spatula she was holding. She did it slowly, the way you set a thing down when you are deciding how to hold yourself, and she turned around, and she looked at Harold Alderman, and she said she understood, and that she would be out of the room by Friday. Her face did not change. Alderman nodded and left. The hands went back to eating. One of them, a man named Gus Pruitt, who had been on the spread for 4 years and eaten Nora's cooking every morning of those 4 years, pushed his plate to the center of the table and put his hat on and walked out without finishing. Nobody said anything. The man at the end of the table had not moved. He was looking at his coffee now. Not at Nora. At his coffee. Then he pushed his chair back slow, deliberate, the legs of it making one long note across the pine floor, and he stood up and carried his plate to the basin the way he always did. Because he was the only man at that table who ever did, and he set it down and said, quietly, to Nora's back, "Is there a telephone I can use?" She pointed to the wall beside the door. There was a telephone there on a small wooden shelf. She had put the shelf up herself in 1952. He said, "Thank you, Nora." He had not used her name before. She went back to the range. He picked up the telephone and asked the operator for a number in Los Angeles. He gave the number from memory. He waited. When the call connected, he said, "It's Wayne. I need to talk to Stuart." There was a pause. Then he said, "I know what time it is there." There was another pause, and then he talked for approximately 4 minutes, which is a long time on a telephone when the person on the other end is not arguing and is listening to what is being said. He spoke in the same even register he used for everything. Not raised. Not hard. The way a man talks when he has already decided what is going to happen and is simply providing the other person with the information they need to arrive at the same conclusion. He said a name. He said the name of the spread and the name of... He said she had been cooking for 9 years and had fed the whole crew for 6 weeks without a complaint from anyone, and he wanted to know if there was a position on the next picture. He listened for a moment. He said, "The one in Utah. I know the schedule." He listened again. He said, "Then, make one." He set the receiver down. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door and put it on and walked out of the cookhouse without looking back at the table or at the range. The screen doors swung shut behind him. Through the window above the sink, Nora heard his boots on the gravel, and then nothing. She stood at the range for a long time. She did not know what the call was. She had heard one end of it. 4 minutes of a man's voice, level as a fence line, and then boots on gravel. 3 days later, a letter came to the cookhouse address. It was from a production company in Los Angeles. It offered Nora Hallett a position as head cook for a location shoot in Kanab, Utah, beginning in late August 19. The pay was $47 a week plus room and board on location. The letter was signed by a man named Stuart Heisler, who was the director of a film called The Lone Ranger that was going into its exterior shoot that fall. Nora read the letter. She read it again. She wrote back and accepted. Then she packed the room that had held 2 people since 1948. If you've ever watched someone absorb an injustice quietly, without making a scene, without asking for anything, just folding it into themselves, and going back to work, drop a comment below. This one is for them. Nora Hallett worked location shoots for 11 years after that June morning. The Utah picture, then a production in Arizona the following spring, then a Western shot outside Santa Fe in the summer of 1960. She learned the work of feeding 40 people on a mobile kitchen in country, where the roads ended and the light came up fast and the crew needed to eat before 5 and be ready by 6. She was good at it the same way she had been good at the cookhouse, not by telling anyone she was good at it, but by doing it, morning after morning. Thomas Hallett came home from West Germany in 1957, the same summer Nora drove south to Utah. He stayed in the Army. He did 2 years in Korea, not during the war but in the long quiet years after it, when the maintenance of a thing is less noticed than the fighting of it. He came out in 1963 as a staff sergeant and settled in Casper, Wyoming, where he worked for the County Roads Department for 20 years. He retired in 1990. He had a daughter named Elaine who became a teacher in Laramie and taught 6th grade for 31 years. Nora retired in 1968. She moved to a small house in Kanab, Utah, because she had spent enough time there that it had become the closest thing to her own town. She was 61 years old. She had been cooking for other people's tables since she was 15. She died in 1979. Thomas brought Elaine to Kanab that October for the service. Elaine was 17. She had never been to Utah. She stood at the edge of the red country outside of town and looked at the messes in the afternoon light and said she understood why her grandmother had stayed. There is a letter in the family's possession. Thomas kept it until he died. And Elaine has it now, in a box with his service medals and the money order for $80 from the ranch north of Dubois, dated February 1948, still folded on its original crease. The letter from Stuart Heisler's production company, typed on studio letterhead, offering Nora Hallett $47 a week and room and board in Kanab, Utah. The paper has gone the color of old cream. The type on it is still sharp. Nobody in that family ever knew who made the call. Elaine Hallett teaches her students about the difference between a decision and a gesture. A gesture is something you do so it can be seen. A decision is something you do because it is the correct next thing, and whether anyone watches or not is beside the point. She did not know she was talking about John Wayne when she said it. John Wayne never spoke of it. Not to Stuart Heisler. Not to any member of the cast or crew on the Utah picture. Not in any interview. Not in any letter anyone ever found. It was not something he carried as a story. It was a phone call he made before breakfast and then got in a truck and drove back to the mountains, where the light was right and there was work to do. There is a kind of man who listens to what a room has decided not to hear, who notices that a woman has been setting a plate in front of him for 3 weeks and has not once asked for anything in return, and understands without being told, without making a calculation, that she is owed something the room is not going to give her. Who picks up a telephone at 7:45 in the morning and speaks for 4 minutes and then puts his hat on and walks out? Because the work is done and there is nothing left to say. The measure of a man is not what he does when the room is watching. If this story reached you, share it with someone who... Subscribe if you haven't yet. There are more stories like this one, and every one of them deserves to be told. And unfortunately, they don't make men like John Wayne anymore.